Welcome to Woldsman's Endgames. In two earlier videos, I showed you how to deploy the frontal defense in the ending of Rook versus Rook and Pawn. We looked at the games between Thulfson and Reinfeld and between Rudd and Gordon. Now, in both of these examples, the extra pawn was a knight's pawn that was not advanced further than the 5th rank. While the frontal defense holds against a knight's pawn or a rook's pawn, it isn't sufficient against a bishop's pawn or a centre pawn. So this video is a sequel that aims to show why passive defense with a rook on the 1st rank fails against a bishop's pawn, and also to demonstrate a related defensive strategy that can hold these endings. The game the Woldsman has selected for its instructive value was played between James Mason and Nicholas MacLeod in the 6th American Chess Congress of 1889. MacLeod was twice Canadian champion, while James Mason was born in Ireland but spent most of his life in the United States and England. James Mason can be considered one of the strongest players of the later 19th century, along with Wilhelm Steinitz. Mason and MacLeod had access to very little endgame theory at the time this game was played, and so they should be considered chess pioneers, having to work out for themselves exactly how to play positions of this kind. Well, let's consider the position with black to move. Material is level, but white is attacking the f-pawn with his rook. Black's king is on the back rank, cut off by the white rook. It's in opposition, though, to the white king, and does currently occupy the queening square, c8. And finally, the black rook is mid-rank, located behind the enemy king and pawn, and able to go to the assistance of the black f-pawn, or to fall back to d8, guarding against a back rank checkmate. So the question is, how should black proceed? What is the best way to defend this position? Well, if you'd like to think about black's options, pause the video here. Okay, well, welcome back if you had a go at this problem. Well, let's begin by looking at how the game itself continued. MacLeod chose to advance his pawn here, and he played the move f3. Now the rook appears to defend the pawn, but in fact the defense is illusory. Mason replied rook f8 check, and now the only move in this position is for the black rook to come to d8, blocking the check. And this allows white to capture the pawn. Rook takes f3. And so black must now pin all his hopes on a passive frontal defense, because his rook cannot now leave the 1st rank. For example, if the rook were to come to d7, then white has rook f8 check, forcing, after rook d8, an exchange of rooks. Rook takes rook check, king takes rook, and now king b7 controls the queening square, and white wins the king and pawn ending. So instead black has to wait. Now it doesn't really matter what order these waiting moves are played. White can force the winning setup regardless. In the game, MacLeod chose to wait with the move king b8. White played king b6, making room for the pawn to advance. And black played another waiting move. He moved his rook to h8, maximising the potential checking distance. White advanced with c6. Black waited again with rook g8. And now white brought his rook to the 7th rank, rook f7. And black simply cannot prevent this setup from being established. a further waiting move was played, rook e8. And from here, the winning procedure for white is straightforward. It begins with a check. White plays rook b7 check. And whichever way the black king goes, black is unable to prevent an exchange of rooks and white establishing a one king and pawn ending. If the king goes to the corner, king a8, then white checks on a7. The black king must come to b8. White checks again with the pawn. There is again only one move, king c8. And now with rook a8 check, white forces the exchange of rooks and queens the pawn. In the game, MacLeod instead played the move king c8. But this was answered by rook a7. And this rook move is why the frontal defense against a bishop pawn fails. Unlike the knight's pawn, white has an extra file on the short side of the pawn with which to work. The final moves of the game were king d8, rook a8 check, and here MacLeod resigned. After king e7, white will exchange rooks. He can now play king c7, king d7, and king b7 controls the queening square and wins the game. So MacLeod's f3 was a losing move, and it loses because it consigns black to passive frontal defense. But black can make a draw from this position. So congratulations if you chose instead the move king b8. Now the idea behind this move is to access the A file, and in particular the squares a7 and a6, which as we shall see are very useful. White picks up the f-pawn, rook takes f4, and now the best move in the position is rook h3, maximising the lateral checking distance. After rook f8 check, king a7, rook f7 check, the black king can now come to the square a6, king a6. Now other moves are in fact possible in this position. Black could have played king a8 or king b8, but I want to show you a key setup which black should be heading for. And it's better to head for this setup sooner rather than later. Black's king is in fact more than okay on the A file. From here, the king is close to the passed pawn, and it's not cut off by the white rook. So we're looking at a very different scenario to that of the Lucena position. In fact, at the moment, the two kings are in opposition. And you'll notice that black's king is also on the correct short side of the pawn, taking away shelter from the white king, and in particular keeping an eye on the square b6, which as we will see is a key square. The white king, on the other hand, is potentially exposed to lateral checks, since the black rook is now very well placed, maximising the potential checking distance. Okay, so from here white might play king c7, and again black's best course is to force the key setup by attacking the pawn, rook h5, and after the pawn advances, the rook can fall back to the first rank, rook h8. Again, other moves are possible, but this is the setup that black wants. It's a first rank defence with the king on the short side of the pawn and the rook operating at distance. And this setup cannot be broken. Well, let's look at two options for white from this position to demonstrate the robustness of this version of a first-rank defence. So let's first of all consider a waiting strategy. Let's look at some moves. Rook e7, black comes back with king a7, and the white rook marks time and comes to g7. White is simply hoping that black will move his pieces to less good squares. So for example here, the move king a8 would be a terrible mistake because it surrenders control of b6. The white king can come to king b6 with a winning position, breaking the first rank defence. Instead though, black can simply go back, king a6. There are many other waiting moves, but this is the simplest. And after rook e7, king a7 brings about a repetition of a position that's already occurred on the board. So white can try another tactic from here. Last time round he played rook g7, but he can play instead the move rook e1, threatening the check rook a1. So black has to do something about this, but the remedy is to hand. He can start these lateral checks from distance. Rook h7 check, king comes to d6, the black rook checks again on h6, white king comes to d7, black check, rook checks again on h7, and so white blocks with his rook e7, but black returns his rook to the first rank with rook h8. And now there is no way to make progress. If white pushes his pawn, c7, then black has king b7, and that takes care of the pawn. And if white plays king c7, then surprise, surprise, black plays again king a6, and no progress has been made. Okay, so that was white's first strategy. Now there's something else though that white can do from here, and that is to try and contest control of the first rank. So let's have a look at this option. White again starts with rook e7, black king as before goes to a7, the rook comes to the d file, rook d7, black king again goes to a6, and now white plays this move rook d8, ejecting the rook from its post on the first rank. But black rook is not particularly bothered by this. It gives a check on h7. And now, unfortunately for white, the move king c8 would lose the pawn to king b6. And so the white king has to retreat. It goes to d6. And there is a nasty little trap here that it's easy to fall into. A mistake would be to play king b6, because after rook b8 check, king a7, white has the move c7, and that pawn will cost black a rook. However, in answer to king d6, black can simply check again, rook h6 check. And after king c5, rook h5 check, the white rook blocks with rook d5, black returns his rook to the familiar square rook h8. And white's pieces are in fact a worse position than they were before. The game might continue from here, rook e5, king a7, white can play rook e7 check, and here there is only one move that holds the draw. But one move is of course all you need. Black comes back, king a6 guarding that key b6 square one more time, and it's clear that white has made no progress at all. The position remains drawn. So thank you very much for watching this video. I hope that it helps you defend these positions in your own games.